Morning and welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019, and can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. Agenda item 1, we have received apologies from Graham Simpson. Tom Mason is in attendance as Graham's substitute. You've had a hard time with names recently, Tom. I welcome Tom Mason to the committee. For agenda item 1, I ask Tom Mason to indicate whether he has any relevant interest to declare.
Yes, Convener, I draw your attention to my register of interest, and in particular I'm a Aberdeen City Councillor and a council taxpayer in Aberdeen City, Highlands and Islands, and of course as an MSP in Edinburgh as well, as temporary resident.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is a consideration of whether to take agenda item 6 in private. This item is consideration of key themes arising from today's evidence. Are we all agreed? Thank you, that's agreed. Agenda item 3, the committee will now hold a roundtable evidence session this morning. This follows on from previous sessions where we've explored the ability of communities to engage with and influence alcohol licensing decisions in their areas. There will be a particular focus on alcohol licensing and public health today. I will have to absent myself at around 10:50 for other committee-related business, and if the session is still continuing at this point, Sarah Boyack will take the chair. So can I welcome you all here today and thank you for your written submissions, which have been very useful in preparing for this session. Perhaps we should go round the table and introduce ourselves, starting with myself and then to my right. I'm James Dornan, MSP for Glasgow Cathcart and the convener of the Local Government Committee.
I'm Sarah Boyack, Deputy Convener and MSP for Lothian.
Elena Smith, Health Improvement Lead for Alcohol Licensing with Glasgow City HSCP and Renfrewshire HSCP.
I'm Councillor Norman Work. I'm the convener of the Edinburgh Licensing Board.
I'm Alexander Stewart, MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
Good morning, my name is Maria Reid. I'm Interim Head of Health Improvement for NHS Lanarkshire, representing the Director of Public Health and the 2 health and social care partnerships today.
Annabel Ewing, MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency.
Good morning, I'm Mary Miller, Clerk to the City of Glasgow Licensing Board.
Andy Whiteman, MSP for Lothian.
Tom Mason, MSP for North East of Scotland.
Good morning, James Douglas, Legal Services Manager at Inverclyde Council and Clerk to Inverclyde Licensing Board.
Kenneth Gibson, MSP for Cunningham North constituency.
I'm Margaret Mary Cairns, Legal Services Manager with South Lanarkshire Council, responsible for litigation, licensing and registration.
I'm Aidan Collins, Senior Coordinator for Alcohol Focus Scotland.
Okay, thank you very much. And to my left, we have the official report, Spice Research and the clerks to the committee who provide the committee with support and won't be taking part in the discussion. Although to be fair, the discussion wouldn't be taking part at all if it wasn't for all the hard work that they'd already done in advance. We'll move straight on to questions, and I would like to ask the questions. The City of Glasgow highlighted an innovation in their area where the local health and social care partnership has a member of staff with specific responsibility for alcohol licensing. The post holder, which I believe we have present today, considers every licence application and makes submissions where necessary. Could you maybe start off by telling us how this works and if you think it could be replicated elsewhere? And just remember, please, round table discussion, so feel free to catch my eye and participate when you feel.
Thanks. My post is unique. It was identified as a priority for both Glasgow City and Renfrewshire ADP, and the funding was identified through that, so it's permanently funded. The post is hosted within the Health and Social Care Partnership Health Improvement teams, so it does have a level of autonomy. And what that does is it allows me to work with all our ADP partners, including our Public Health Director, to look at what are the impacts in relation to alcohol for the communities of both these areas. So in terms of the policy statement, I take a very broad population-based approach in terms of what evidence is required. But in terms of the individual application, that does come down to the information that we have in relation to alcohol-related harms. And I do a kind of triage process of assessing, is this an area where we have concerns in relation to alcohol-related harms? If the answer to that is yes, further investigation is done as to whether that level of harm is at a good enough level that would warrant a response being submitted to the licensing board. And I think this approach, I have to thank my colleague Sarah Graham, who pioneered this post in Glasgow before I came into post just over a year ago. And we have been able to establish a good level of evidence that the board can understand and are able to realise whether we have reached a threshold level in order for them to apply the public health objective for rejecting any applications. I would ask Mary to come in on this because I'm sure she can probably speak more on the board's half for that.
I don't think you can underestimate at all the role that Elena has played in relation to providing the necessary evidential basis that you do need in dealing with individual applications. If you are to properly promote the licensing objective around public health, you do need that local-based information to show what the likelihood of the impact of adding another alcohol licence in a particular area, and it does need to be focused on the particular application. I think it's right that they carry out that triage process that Elena described. But I think if you look at a situation where there is no objection from public health, I think it's then difficult to probably articulate a ground for refusal that could then be justified and stand up to appeal if it was challenged. So I really do think it is a crucial role.
Just you were saying if there's no objections from public health, are they now, would it be that beforehand they wouldn't have objected because they couldn't really see a lot of point and they're now objecting more often, or has that not changed in any way?
At one point in the past, we had almost a sort of scattergun where the NHS were putting in an objection to every application, and it was very difficult then to attach weight because it was very generic in nature and it didn't relate to the specifics of the application. And very quickly, you know, agents representing clients will be able to dismiss that type of generic approach, so very little weight can be attached to it. So I think it is that very targeted, direct, localised information that is the key to making use of the objective. And I think that there is an issue that where you don't have that type of information, refusing an application based on the licensing objective relating to public health is much more challenging and very difficult to justify.
Okay, I wonder if one, before I move it on, could give us some idea of what you exactly mean by the triage work that gets done before this decision is made?
So when an application comes into me, I look at the information that I'm provided with, and initially, and this kind of demonstrates the process that myself and the board have been through, initially I just used to get the standard letter that went out, which had very little information, so I wasn't able to fully establish what that premises were planning to do with their alcohol licence. And I would have to go back to the licensing team to say, can you give me more information? I'd go to the licensing standards officer to get an understanding of what was going on in that area also. We've now moved to a position where I do get the operating plan and the application, so I'm able to see exactly what the licensing team see, and I'm able to properly assess and question whether the information that is available within that application and operating plan gives me enough sense to say if there's an issue with that licence or not. There are occasions where very little information is available and you do come a cropper at the actual licensing board day when the agent will come in with lots of additional information that we have not been privy to beforehand. So once I've established that there is something within the application that might give me cause for concern, I look at the area where the premises is located. I then look at the statistics in relation to the alcohol-related harm. We have 4 measures that we look at. So alcohol-related hospital stays, alcohol-related deaths, alcohol-related brain damage, admissions, and mental health discharges related to alcohol. We do weight more heavily towards the alcohol-related hospital stays, as that is the barometer of what is happening in the more immediacy in relation to the harm within the community. The deaths are our ultimate, actually we don't want to be seeing that rising, so if it's already at a high level, there is concern there. Mental health data is giving me more cause for concern, but actually it's making me go away and actually look more at that, because there are some areas where we can't understand why our figures are rising at such a level, but we know our mental health alcohol-related figures relate to inpatient services, and when we have got a move away from inpatient support, that does give me cause for concern about what is going on. If all of these indicators are above a certain statistical level, i.e. they are in their top 25% of worst areas, that will make me go away and investigate further. I do due diligence, I go out and visit the area where the premises is located, and I will try and touch base with the services that are also in the area in order to get a sense of what else is happening in terms of local availability of alcohol and the impact of alcohol-related harm on that community. It's not always easy because we don't always know what's going on, and when you have communities which are very close to actually engaging with formal services, we don't fully get the picture. But I do try my best to link in with the local services through our health improvement teams who have good relationships in those communities. Once that's been established, I then draw up my response letter and submit that to the board.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody want to come in on this point just now? No.
Aye, thanks, Convener. It's interesting to hear how Glasgow Licensing Board operates with their dedicated officer, and maybe that's something that licensing boards themselves can take good practice from. On the City of Edinburgh Council Licensing Board, we have a Lothian Health Board who reports on applications, and it was interesting to hear what Mary said, you know, because they don't report on every application, otherwise it would just be the, you know, sort of usual sort of report. It is on areas of maybe over provision or areas that they have concern about, and they will ask if the board will consider continuing for a report. We can study all the statistics about health-related matters and police crime statistics, etc. So on that basis, we have a slightly different way of operating, but in some ways it's the same.
Okay. Okay, Annabelle, you were.
Yes. I think the discussion's very interesting. I mean, I was very interested to read the submission from Glasgow City Council on this, what seems to be a fairly innovative approach, and it's. I assume that Glasgow City Council feels that this is entirely within the parameters of the applicable legislation, and it seems to work in alongside, in terms of other localities for licensed premises, the over-provision provisions, if you like. So I just wonder, because that seems to me to be, within the law, a really, really good approach to catching every potential, or as many potential problems as possible. And I don't see, although I may be wrong, I don't see that other local authorities are doing this. And I just wonder, why not? And would it not be about sharing best practice? And if this is working in Glasgow, you know, would it not be appropriate for other local authorities to consider proceeding with such a regime? And
see, when you're answering that question, can you maybe say what it is that you do, you know, the way that your licensing works, Mr Douglas?
In Inverclyde, we had an over-provision policy in place for 5 years, and we came to that conclusion based on primarily police and crime figures and alcohol-related illness figures. The following that 5 years, when we got the same figures back, it was shown that there was no discernible decrease. In fact, there was next to no change in either crime figures or alcohol-related illnesses within that area of over-provision. So Inverclyde took a view at the last policy to keep the matter under review, but to delete our over-provision policy as it stood. It essentially took in Central Greenock. And as I said, the figures didn't support it. Now, what we always have to keep in mind is that any licensing board's policy is capable of being judicially reviewed at any time. So therefore, we thought it would be a dangerous thing to keep that over-provision policy in place, given that we could be judicially reviewed and we simply didn't have evidence to support it. I have to say that we were all doing these policies at the same time. Now that I've read Marion Glasgow's report, it's something that I'm going to have to bring back to the board to see what we can do. But remember that this is all set against a background of drastic cuts to local government funding. I simply can't magic people out of thin air to employ on behalf of the licensing board, for example. But however, I do take what you say about sharing good practice, and that's something that we'll certainly look at.
Hold on a second. Mary was wanting to come in.
Just to make clear that the position isn't in any way funded through licensing board. It is entirely separate from the licensing board, so it's more a consultee role through the Community Health and Care Partnership, not through anything connected with the licensing board directly.
So this would have no impact on local government financing?
Other than arrangements, perhaps Alina would be better to speak to that.
My post is directly funded through the Alcohol and Drug Partnership. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde do look at this as a board-wide perspective, and it has been devolved down to the local partnership level, and that's where the implication comes in relation to finance. So if the Health and Social Care Partnership hasn't been able to establish finance to be able to have this as a dedicated post, which it hasn't in the other areas that are covered by Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I am fortunate in that Glasgow City and Renfrewshire Health and Social Care Partnership identified funds from ADP, the Alcohol and Drug Partnership. But I know that in the other areas, they have not been able to identify purely dedicated funding for this type of post. It is a role that is done in addition to posts, and certainly in East Renfrewshire, it's the Alcohol and Drug Partnership Coordinator. In Inverclyde, I believe there is somebody who has been identified just recently, but I'm not sure yet who that is, and I'm hoping to establish a meeting with them next week. In East Dumbartonshire, again, it's another health improvement person who does it as part of their wider role, and the same in West Dumbartonshire.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle, you wanted to come in.
Briefly, Mr Douglas, explained the approach that Inverclyde has taken to the over-provision regime. I just when did Inverclyde decide to remove that? Was it quite recent?
Yeah, November 2018.
Right. So I guess then there would nonetheless require to be a reflection over the next few years as to whether perhaps there could be an increase in the stats.
Absolutely.
Further to that removal of the.
Yeah. What we have said to the forum, who has the ADP member on it, Police Scotland, etc., to please keep an eye on this and to bring it back to us if there was any sort of discernible increase in any of the crime figures or the alcohol-related illness. Because I think I probably have to make it clear that the board would love to support what they regard as a very laudable principle. It's just what Vary's alluded to. How do you show causal link when you're getting questioned in a courtroom a few months later? Especially for new premises. If a premises has never operated and has never sold a single can of lager, how can you refuse a licence when there's a presumption of grant? I mean, that's the starting position. There's a presumption of grant, and there's no evidence to support any idea that these establishments have been involved in any way, shape or form with contributing towards alcohol-related illness. Because I think I probably have to make it clear that one of the worst areas in Inverclyde for alcohol-related illness has no alcohol outlets, none.
Kenny, you were wanting to come in briefly
Yeah,
here.
it was actually on Inverclyde thing, which I found really interesting, their submission. I mean, first of all, Edinburgh says, and I quote, there remains an ongoing challenge with regard to the public health licensing objective when determining individual applications and linking health data provided for larger localities in order to demonstrate causation, considering such individual applications. And I think that goes back to what's just been said with Inverclyde. People are very mobile. I mean, in Inverclyde, obviously, you've got large, large shopping centre areas such as Tesco's, where people no doubt buy the stuff and then take it home. So it is really difficult. So maybe the issue about over-provision should be extended across local authority areas where practical. Local authorities are of course different sizes, but maybe a town, the whole town of Greenock or Port Glasgow, whatever, could be considered in the future if that was to be revisited. But the point I was going to ask really, Mr Douglas, was in the second last paragraph. He said, Inverclyde Licensing Board are of the view that current law does not empower boards to deliver public health objectives. But it doesn't really then to go on to say how the law could possibly be changed to do that. So I'm just wondering if you can perhaps enlighten us and to help us take this forward.
Okay. It was the one question that I was dreading getting asked the whole way here.
Thank you, Kenny.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I can say is that I regard it as a laudable principle. But I'm not sure how boards can be asked to promote the public health objective unless there was strong statutory grounds for basically backing a licensing board. If they were just to draw a line in the sand, for example, and say, this is what we as local elected members think the situation should be, and that we were pretty much safeguarded from challenge in the courts. When we are appealed on matters where we believe that we're versed in law, for example, it's the council that's paying out that money. It's not the NHS, it's not Police Scotland, it's the council that's paying that money. And members will obviously have to receive legal advice that if there is next to no evidence to show how you can come to a decision, then it would be very dangerous to do so.
Right, I'm going to let Aidan in and then Maria, and then we'll move on to other aspects of it. But surely the work in Glasgow might be one route into that evidence that you're talking about. Aidan?
Yeah, I can provide some national perspective. So you'll probably be aware the licensing boards had to publish their new Statements of Licensing policy in November 2018. So AFS undertook a review of the published statements, and what we're really looking to see is there any sort of emerging trends nationally? Is there examples of good practice? And actually, is there areas of continued challenge? So some good news. You can see measures to promote the health objective in actually every policy statement, I would say to varying extents, and you can identify it with different levels of ease. But over-provision definitely remains one of the main ways that boards are seeking to promote public health. So out of the published 38 policies, I think it was 15 had found over-provision to some extent. 20 boards had found no over-provision, and there was a couple that were still actually consulting in that particular aspect of the policy. I would say in sort of terms of changes from the last statements, there was a handful where it had increased and a handful where it has decreased, but the vast majority actually have retained their existing policies. I would say what really stands out actually is that boards are approaching their assessments of over-provision very differently, and they're applying very different standards of proof. And this is where it gets a bit abstract and hard to explain. But in some areas, boards almost see the need to demonstrate the causal link as meaning they have to prove definitively that X equals or will cause Y. And in other areas, boards interpret it as meaning, well, actually, we need to show that it's more likely than not that X causes Y. So they go more on a sort of balance of probabilities. So I'll give you some examples of what boards have said. In a couple of areas, they reported they couldn't establish causal link because the harm they identified because alcohol wasn't the direct and sole consequence of the numbers of premises. Now, in the real world, it would be, it'd be impossible to actually prove that the harm you identify is the direct and sole consequence of the number of premises, because there's just so many confounding factors in real life that you could never control for. In other areas, what boards have said is, well, we can see evidence of a correlation between harm and numbers of premises, but actually that evidence falls short of meeting the casual test required by law. So there you have that question. Well, actually, what level of evidence is required to justify an over-provision finding? So, when does that balance of probabilities tip in favour of something being causal as opposed to correlational? Other things we can see that have come up are things like actually trying to link harm to specific premises is really hard because people travel to purchase alcohol. We've seen a rise in online sales, and that can be really challenging. And actually into the mix, we don't have sales data, so we don't know where people are buying their alcohol or how much they're buying. So having sort of highlighted these challenges, what I would say is there's still a large number of boards that are actually very confident, that have looked at the evidence, they've created a robust policy based on that balance of probabilities. So what the review of the policy shows is actually there's real inconsistency. And I think it goes back to what Annabelle was saying around, well, actually, can we promote the good practice and actually provide boards with a bit more guidance and support? And I'll bring up Glasgow again, actually. So sorry, Mary, it keeps coming back to you, but there's actually also a really promising new approach that we've seen, which has been adopted in Glasgow. And what the board there have done is said, actually, in areas that are experiencing really high levels of harm, we will still reserve the right to refuse additional off-licences in that area, because the evidence the board had gathered actually identified, well, if someone's already experiencing harm, throwing extra off-sales availability into the mix is likely to make that problem worse. So that actually is really promising, because it detaches the health objective from over-provision to an extent, and it shifts the focus from numbers of premises actually to what harm communities are experiencing. So again, I think that's a really promising bit of good practice that we could be supporting, strengthening and getting boards to share. And that might help counter a lot of the problems that are being experienced.
Okay, thank you. Maria?
Thank you, Convener. No, what I wanted to do was follow up from what Elena had said about what capacity they have in Glasgow around her dedicated post. So from an NHS Lanarkshire perspective, our Director of Public Health has not had the capacity, unfortunately, to really service the 2 licensing boards. So that's regrettable, because we recognise that it is an important issue. And furthermore, it has been one of my priorities this year to consider how I put some dedicated capacity around from a health improvement perspective, so that we can have a post similar in some ways to the post that Elena describes. So that's really partly an observation based on the very good practice that I hear that Elena's saying. And I think following on from Aidan's comments, it makes me more assured and convinced that it's something that would be very, very beneficial. And I think it's then a conversation we need to have with the ADPs, and be clear then about what the ADP's functions are in supporting the wider public health agenda within the context of the reform around public health and the future role of Public Health Scotland, and how we see that interconnection in terms of a whole systems approach. Because I think that, we've obviously seen there are varying levels of practice, as described by Aidan. We've seen one good model of practice, and I have to admit that in terms of what I think we do from a health improvement and public health perspective, I know it falls short of a measure that we are not satisfied with. And I think that we can say it's capacity, but it's also certainly the skills and the expert knowledge, and then the comfort that the licensing board are going to be receptive to us giving our time and energy to that situation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bring Sarah in, and Andy, do you want to come inside?
Yeah, I'd wanted to pick up the point. A few people have said the need for guidance and a mix of learning from best practice and being clear about what's going to work. So I wanted to pick up, the committee spoke to the Minister in evidence earlier, and one of the things that has been brought forward is draft guidance, which specifically mentions public health issues. So I wanted to ask people whether that guidance, as drafted, you think is being potentially helpful in enabling people to establish that causal link between health evidence and then reaching a decision. So those of you who are on the ground or the national perspective, do you think the guidance is in the right place? Will it help?
I think the guidance update's very well intentioned, and I appreciate a lot of effort, a significant amount of effort went into trying to update aspects of the guidance to support boards when they were developing new policy statements. But being honest, that process was extremely rushed, and there wasn't wide enough consultation, and that resulted in a product that is quite inconsistent around over-provision. There's aspects that we can see where, yeah, actually this is attempting to help, but there's similarly other areas where you think this just confuses over-provision even further. we were delighted the Scottish Government decided to have an open consultation on the guidance. I think it was somewhere in the region of 40 responses that they got. Certainly when I looked through, there's some very common themes, and we're hopeful that the Scottish Government will take time to actually consider the range of evidence and adapt that guidance as appropriate. But certainly as it stands, I wouldn't say it's fit for purpose.
Well, I'm interested in what you think the inconsistencies are. I mean, the key paragraph is, in considering whether there's a causal link, the licensing board should assess whether, on balance of probabilities, the harm identified is caused by the sale of alcohol in the locality. So is that statement all right? And it's the rest of the document that actually gets muddled?
Actually, even because this is the way licensing is, so that seems when you first hear it, oh, that's quite reasonable. But what would happen in practice is people would say, well, it's the sale of alcohol, but we don't have sales data, so we don't actually know. I think what the guidance needs to move more towards is making it about the availability of alcohol. And we've heard problems in relation to, well, if it's within a particular locality, people travel, we've got online sales, so that's very problematic. So I think in the guidance update, we need to factor in these kind of things, look at where the challenges are, look at where the good practice is happening, and come up with something that helps us all find a better way forward.
What do other panel members think?
A different view. I tend to think that the legislation actually does give boards enough power around over-provision and public health, and it comes down to the evidence which is made available to the board in dealing with either setting out matters of policy when it comes to an over-provision assessment, and probably more importantly dealing with individual applications. And I should stress that it's not a matter of because there's an objection and an application will automatically be refused. It's about testing the information which is given through the objection from the health board, and looking at what the applicant says to maybe to mitigate or challenge that information. But I do think that the legislation itself does give appropriate powers. It's how boards use the powers that are currently available. And I probably would say that the use of guidance can be overstated. I really do think it does come down to policy statements and information available at an individual application rather than what the statutory guidance says.
Elena, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, there's several things I would like to sort of pick up on in terms of what has been said. Yeah, the policy is key in this, because if a board sets out the policy to say what its understanding of public health is, it's very clear to everybody. And that allows us to then be able to continue to reinforce that message. The availability and accessibility are key components within the public health objective. The accessibility is a real key challenge for myself at the moment, especially in relation to home delivery of alcohol and the immediacy of that for certain areas, especially around the huge growth in the use of these delivery companies, whether that be with or without food. It's something that is ever growing, and understanding the impact that is having on a particular community and what an additional licence or a variation to a licence will cause is kind of the crux of what my role is. But ultimately, this does come down to what would be a legal challenge in the court, as has been mentioned for Inverclyde. And I think that's a fear that certainly in Renfrewshire I see, because I cover that board area too. And where I've given significant harms within areas, but yet it has been granted because they don't have the confidence in how the evidence is presented, because they don't have it robustly within the policy in terms of public health, like I have within Glasgow's.
So, sorry, can I just clarify there? Are you saying that if the boards, local authorities, change the policy direction in the way that Glasgow has, then that you feel that would cover them for a legal challenge?
I would hope so. I would hope so. It's not to say we can never know what a legal challenge will actually do.
But Glasgow's confident that they're covered to a great extent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's probably as good as I was going to get for you anyway.
But
Sorry.
I think from a national perspective, it would be great, and maybe that's where the guidance can come in, because I judge my inference in terms of how far above the Scottish rate is the harm experienced within that area. The Scottish rate is bad, as we all know, and if you are significantly above the Scottish rate, then you've got a lot of harm going on in that area. So that is something that potentially could be inferred within the public health objective guidance. And it's certainly a stance that I take when I'm assessing any individual application, but I also look at it from the broader perspective of what's my policy able to back me up on for that board area? What have they already said they are willing to make sure is enforced in a public health perspective? And it's not just about over-provision. And I think we are totally entangled in the over-provision relating to the number of premises. That is not what it's about. It is about the accessibility and ease of access to alcohol within that community.
Because the access method has changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'll come back to say that. I'll bring you in later on.
Well, directly now. It might actually be seen as a Daft Lassie question, but you're just saying the issue of numbers in terms of over-provision isn't critical. Can I ask to what extent community health sits alongside this? Because there's an issue about access to alcohol, but there's also the issue of number of licensed premises in an area causing public health problems in terms of community health. How do you factor that in?
I think we have to recognise deprivation and poverty, and the impacts within communities also plays a significant part within this. We have the ScotFord report, which looked at the overall burden of alcohol in the disease process, which goes beyond what the measures that we already look at. And it demonstrated that deprivation increases the harm by a significant, I can't remember the figure offhand at the moment, but it's something in the region of you're 8.4 times more likely to establish harm from alcohol by living in a deprived area. So yeah, deprivation does play a part. Access to services and also knowing what is actually available to help you. But if you are in a community where all you're seeing are convenience stores selling alcohol, fast food outlets that also provide alcohol easily, but yet you might not have access to good food and good examples of sensible drinking, then that does have an impact on how alcohol is consumed. I suppose this is where I can bring in about normalisation. The fact that alcohol is seen as an everyday commodity, it is used as an argument for every application that comes forward, especially in relation to off sales, about this being part of a basket shop. I think we have to change that whole ethos within society. But we're also now seeing the insidious leak into other areas where hairdressers are now providing alcohol. I have one within Renfrewshire which is licensed to provide up to 3 alcoholic drinks in a very small salon where children will be sitting in amongst other users of that service. And when I asked the question about the impact in relation to the recovery community, I didn't really get a positive response in relation to that. So there's very few sort of safe alcohol-free areas where people can consider that they can go now as well.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Andy?
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. I just want to clarify a few points about sort of Glasgow's policy. So in their policy statement, this is related to off sales, and it is out with the statutory over-provision bit of the law. That judicial review is a mechanism whereby people can challenge decisions made by policymakers, not in terms of their merits, but in terms of whether they have the power to take that decision, whether they follow the appropriate process in terms of consultation and all the rest of it. So if Glasgow's policy on this, and it's just one example of a policy that's been adopted to try and advance one of the objectives of licensing regulation, if it's is not being challenged. Maybe because people think it can't be challenged. It may be because there's not many cases being brought which are being rejected on the basis of that policy. Then it seems to me fairly clear that no local authority should be reluctant to try and innovate in this area as long as the policy, and I've just read Glasgow's Chapter 9, is clear and very well associated with the law and what it's there for, is beyond doubt, and has been introduced with the appropriate process of consultation and adoption by the council and all the rest of it. So, and the final point is, it seems to me that this is, although James Douglas talked about resources, and that's critical, obviously resources is critical, this is a matter of policy fundamentally. The resources is something you need to put in place to implement the policy, but it's the policy that's the most important thing. Would that be a fair characterisation of some of the issues around this?
Mary, you want to come in first and then the others?
Obviously, I would agree with everything said there. The policy itself, again, it's about gathering that evidence, but you can have the best policy in the world, but if you don't have the evidence and individual application, then you won't have a basis in which to refuse that application. I think that the policy that we have developed in Glasgow around off-sales is setting apart the public health objective from over-provision, and it is that issue that you can have an area where there's relatively low number or no alcohol premises, but there's obviously problems in that area with people suffering from alcohol-related ill health. And the view the board have taken that, generally speaking, there may be an issue in actually making it easier for people who live in that local area to buy alcohol if this application is granted, and that could actually exacerbate issues which are already there. And that's where the board looks to establish that in itself probably creates that necessary causal link, because if you have, for example, a shop, a convenience store, by its very nature it's targeting those that live in the local area, and if it's looking to sell alcohol, then that could, as I say, make it easier for people who live there to purchase alcohol, and then that's where the concern arises. In terms of issues around challenge, I think a policy is actually probably most successful if people are taking informed decisions about whether or not to lodge an application, and it's sometimes difficult to measure the success of a policy because it might actually be deterring people from actually putting in a new application for an off-sale in an over-provision area or an area where there are is evidence of alcohol-related harm. And what our policy is focusing on is allowing people to make those informed decisions. And no doubt, I do hear this, that there will be agents who have clients come along to them and explore the possibility of an application in a particular area, and they may well be given advice that they are unlikely to be successful and that application isn't then actually made.
Does anybody from one of the other councils want to talk about the reasoning behind the points that Andy and Mary have made there? If it works for Glasgow and if it's strong for Glasgow, then why can't it be the same in other local authorities? Or do you disagree with the points that Andy made?
I don't disagree with what Mary's saying at all. However, I see that there could be practical issues for my own area, in as much as that some of the areas, you did touch on this, Mary, but we have an area where there are no alcohol outlets at all, none, and it is one of the worst areas for alcohol-related illness. How is it possible for me to say to a sheriff that the opening up of one convenience store, for example, if something came forward like that, that it should be refused on the basis that it could make matters worse? They've clearly had no input, these new premises, in the alcohol-related illness that exists in that particular area at the moment. Now, I hear what Mary's saying, and it's obviously the argument that I would proffer if I was before the sheriff arguing that point, but you can bet your bottom dollar that the solicitors acting on behalf of the applicant will be saying there is no causal link here whatsoever. I have read Glasgow's report, just like your policy, just like yourselves, and what I have done is I'm putting it onto the agenda for the next meeting of our licensing board to see whether or not there's things from this that we can look at. And I was heartened to hear that Inverclyde may be getting a dedicated EDP person, just like yourself. Because we, as I say, I want to make it clear, the Inverclyde Licensing Board believe that what the objective is very laudable, and especially coming from an area that has really quite bad statistics. I think it's Glasgow, Renfrewshire and ourselves that are the worst in Scotland. So we would love to be able to do that. We have, for example, taken policy statements. We have introduced them within our policy statement things like protecting children from harm by saying they're simply not allowed to sit at a bar, because I hear what you're saying about normalisation. It's not normal for an 8-year-old to be sitting up at a bar even if they are taking a meal, so we've banned all that type of thing. We've stopped granting extended hours to football prize giving events where alcohol's being sold, that type of thing, because we can actually, but I don't think we're going to get challenged on that. Where the difficulty is, I think, is that it is a quasi-judicial decision and accordingly has to be mired in evidence. And this, I think, was what Mary's saying. You can have the best policy in the world and there'll be things that we can maybe pick from Glasgow's excellent work. But there's a big difference between theory and practice. And when you're standing before a sheriff and there's a QC from Better Buy Limited saying, why on earth have you refused a premises licence on behalf of this shop when there are no shops in the area selling alcohol at all? It's a very, very difficult hurdle to get over.
I won't accept that, but I also wonder why Glasgow can do it and others can't, and Glasgow can take the chance and others can't.
We haven't been challenged on that
Yeah, but
you've
taken the chance that you will be challenged, is what I mean. No, the point is that they've taken the chance that they may be challenged. That's the point I'm making. Other local authorities haven't.
Can I just come back in? I cover 2 areas. I'm very fortunate in that when I came into post, Glasgow, the groundwork had already been established, and the board there were already working towards addressing the dilemmas that they had experienced over the years in relation to how they could better improve their relationship with the public health objective, hence the policy that has been formulated, and that was done in partnership with a lot of people, including the trade. And I think that's the one thing to remember in this, in that a lot of the time it's not just purely about health. I work very closely with my police colleagues, licensing standards, licensing team, but also I listen to what the trade are saying and I listen to what the community are saying. So it is that whole balanced picture. My post covers Renfrewshire as well, and they hadn't had the benefit of a dedicated person, and therefore their understanding of the health data was not as good. And a lot of what my role is how I articulate that evidence to them as a board. I managed to achieve probably my first real success at Renfrewshire's board on Monday, where a newsagent was refused. And it was on the grounds of over-provision. And that was in an area where there was only one other relevant premises. So they listened to what I was saying about the health evidence, about the worsening trend in that area, and recognised that they did not want to add to that burden, so took the decision to actually refuse the application. Now, that's the first in the just over 14 months that I've been in post that I've managed to actually achieve something. So it is about taking time with the board for them to be able to understand the evidence that you're presenting. And a lot of my groundwork with them was about how do you want to hear this information and how will that stand up in court as well. So, and it's about being consistent with the evidence that I provide and being consistent with the approach.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to come back in?
Well, I wanted to maybe move it on a little bit.
Yep,
I mean, one of the issues the committee's been looking at is community participation in the whole system. I mean, what I was actually going to say, if we were going to stay on this topic broadly, was whether there's an argument for actually reforming the law to make the presumption that there shall be less alcohol outlets than more. I mean, there seems to be fundamental assumptions built into a lot of the legislation that makes it difficult to... But we'll park that for one side. I mean, one of the responses in the 2005 Act was to get local communities more involved in the broad kind of policies around alcohol licensing. And I'm just wondering, we've heard very mixed evidence about the efficacy of these, whether they're indeed worth it at all, and whether folk are even interested in engaging in an area of policy which is quite, I mean, on the face of it, it's quite straightforward, but actually the detail of it is really quite difficult for the public to engage with. And I just wonder if people here have got any thoughts about that process, whether it could be made better or indeed whether it's worth having at all. The local licensing forums.
Norman?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I mean, certainly in Edinburgh, there are several community councils, particularly in the city centre, the Old Town, New Town, Tallcross, Stockbridge areas, who actually have dedicated sort of licence conveners, if you know what I mean, and they are quite active in presenting their case Edinburgh Licensing Board. But I think it depends on the community councils. But certainly, when a community council does submit any, normally an objection, we will invite them up, and we do listen, and we do encourage them to participate. But again, it depends on the community council, and it does tend to be more city centre based community councils rather than community councils outside. But they do have dedicated licence conveners if they deal with that.
I'm aware of the Community Council's role, which is a historic one. The issue I'm raising is particularly the Section 10 provisions of the Act of Local Licensing Forums, where each council must establish a local licensing forum, which are separate from community councils. How effective are they? Or, I mean, from what you're suggesting is they may not be terribly effective at all, but I mean, they're designed to influence policy as opposed to perform the role that community councils do, which is keep an eye on each application and make any representations they wish.
No.
The City of Edinburgh Council does meet, I mean, I think is under legislation, licensing boards have to meet forums, and there are places for community reps on the forum. The problem with forums, and this is where it'll be controversial here, is that licensing, well, the Edinburgh Licensing Forum could not come to a position, an agreed position over provision, because they are made up of all different types of people, and therefore they were unable to come up with one particular, for or against or over provision. So, I mean, the forums play their part, but because they are encompassing everything from the trade to communities, the views are varied, as they should be.
Tom, and then...
Rena, I just endorse that comment just made. The attitude of community councils and forums is always split against those who want to prevent further social disruption in an area, against those who want to get import a vibrant new business opportunity. And certainly in my area in Aberdeen, we have that continual conflict, and therefore you come out with one side, he says that, they say that, and you don't actually get any definite conclusion, regrettably. Otherwise, life would be very simple if you did.
Okay, sorry, I better let Alexander in here because I think he's not talking.
We discussed many things around the table this morning. I think a lot of it has been very positive about the policies and the direction that we're trying to take. But our whole culture with alcohol is still a major issue as a nation, that we have that issue. And we've talked about accessibility and we've talked about the processes. But when you're looking at the communication to organisations and individuals across council areas, and we've heard already this morning that some councils are fearful about maybe doing and progressing. I don't know of any supermarket that doesn't have a large chunk of their floor space given to alcohol. And have we ever challenged any of these supermarkets in any of the council areas about the size and the direction of the way they're going and how they manage that? And also, do councillors themselves that sit on boards, do they feel confident enough in trying to challenge this over-provision when it comes to health themselves? Because they are the ones who are making that decision. And they're taking that decision on the advice that they're given by the professionals who support them. And that could be health, that could be the Licensed Trade Forum, it could be the association. They all have a role to play. But I'm not convinced that councillors themselves feel confident enough, because if they don't, the council itself doesn't feel confident enough to challenge and to progress forward. Does anyone have any views on that?
Mary.
We've only actually been challenged once since the Act came in terms of a decision to refuse an application over provision, and it was a national supermarket, probably one of the largest, and that was a case where at that stage there wasn't an awful case law, nobody really knew how it was going to go. I think the presumption probably was that the supermarket would win, but the licensing board was actually successful in that case, and I think licensing boards shouldn't be concerned about who the potential appellant is. It's about whether you have the evidence to support your decision and that should really be what is the factor in making a decision as to whether or not to refuse the application, whether you think it can stand up to challenge regardless of the likelihood of the challenge or who may make it.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back again to the policy, because the benefit of having your policy is it lets you look at the evidence over a wider area and then make a policy that seeks to promote the objectives based on that kind of bigger picture. But I think what we keep on coming back to is actually applying the evidence on a kind of ad hoc, case-by-case basis is much more difficult. So, you know, when you're looking at an application and you're drilling into that very local level, for a start, some health information is very unreliable. You know, when you're looking at a data zone, maybe of 500 households or even below that at postcode level, it's quite hard to get the evidence. But the other thing is, you know, health harms occur over quite a long period of time, and they can't be linked to a specific premises or a specific area. It's more the sort of sum of individual boards' decisions that have an aggregate effect on availability and consumption and harm. So I think that's got implications for boards in terms of what's their level and understanding about that kind of bigger picture and the links between availability and harm. And there's implications there for health stakeholders around, well, how do you gather evidence, what type of evidence, and how do you actually present that to a board in a meaningful way? We hear quite often maybe boards saying we get health data but it's just irrelevant, or we hear health stakeholders saying actually we put a lot of work in and submit the evidence and then it's just, you know, ignored or unfairly dismissed. Some people say boards focus too much on statistics, they don't care about communities and case studies and community experiences, and other people say, well, boards only care about their own experience and they don't focus enough on statistics. And I think, you know, looking at it from a national point of view, you can see there's a lot of uncertainty around, but what do boards want, you know, what do they need, and actually how can they use different types of information in relation to health. So it is quite a complex area when you get down to that individual application level, and it goes back to the importance of having a really good evidence-based policy that actually all your decision making flows from. You know, it helps navigate some of those complexities.
Because if you don't have the navigation, as you were rightly identified, then it just doesn't take place. You know, people can spend time and effort putting forward reports, and they are just removed, or they're disregarded, or they're not given the credence that they deserve. And that's happening across, because we seem to have the 32 local authorities doing slightly different things to one another. Even neighbouring councils don't seem to do the same thing. They don't collaborate as much as they should or could to try and invest and make that happen. So I still maintain that, you know, we have an issue at the board level that we need to try and manage as well.
Yeah, I like the idea that there's 32 local authorities doing things to one another, like you just suggested there. I'm going to have to go shortly, but there's a question I'd like, that something that came up that Elena said earlier on about evidence that was suddenly produced by the lawyers when they were appealing against the licensing decision. You said that, you know, they might come in with swathes of evidence that you had never seen before. Is there not a responsibility in them to make that evidence available to the licensing board at the initial stage?
I think some of this comes down to how an agent actually submits the application and providing the background to what the premises is there to achieve in terms of its vision. And sometimes it's not always clear in the operating plan as to what that premises is likely to do. So I suppose probably an example of this is when an application comes in for, say, a cafe looking for on and off sales, but yet there's no mention of whether they are planning to do delivery with that off sales. And I know that within Glasgow we are trying desperately to make sure conditions are applied to anything that does have an off sales capacity, because at the moment on operating plans, you don't have to stipulate whether you are going to deliver alcohol as part of your off-sales provision. And therefore, we have no idea where that area of operation is, what areas it is likely to impact, and how you're then able to establish whether that is going to impact on areas which are already experiencing harm.
Is that something you can deal with at local level, or does that change? That
No, we can't deal with it at local level because the forms, the application forms and operating plans are set in stone, and that has received a legal challenge. I think it was Fife received a legal challenge because they had attempted to add in some questions to their operating plan to try and clarify some matters. So this is information that is then subsequently might come through at the board, it might not, but then once a licence is granted, they go off and they do what they want. So it's not necessarily a level playing field in terms of the information that a statutory consultee receives in terms of what they can respond to is not always the full picture. So hence I do go away and do a lot of additional questions. And if we're expecting communities to be able to do that same level of due diligence, I think we're asking an awful lot. And even for statutory consultees like community councils, it's really, really hard for them to be able to fully advise on whether they do have an objection or not to an application.
But really the information should be up there at the very first stage, the full information. Okay. Right. Anybody else have any points you want to make, any questions you'd like to ask? Sarah, do you?
I just had a brief question. I was listening to the Glasgow evidence and the Edinburgh evidence, and thinking about over-provision in a city centre context and then in a wider community context. Do you take a different policy approach in either city to those two distinct geographical areas, given both the wider public health issues and the different community public health issues?
In the Glasgow policy statement, we have specifically said that we don't consider there to be over-provision within the city centre area. Obviously, again, every case is looked at individually, but as a matter of policy, the board generally wouldn't consider there to be over-provision, and it's part of, part of the appeal of the city centre is that the licensed premises play an important part in what attracts people into that area, and it's recognising that. A lot of the policy and over-provision is focused on the concerns around off-sales on the basis that the actual consumption of the alcohol isn't regulated. And there is a distinction made between the regulated consumption of alcohol in a pub or a club where there's oversight of that and where alcohol is sold to be taken away. And really the policy for over-provision and public health focuses more on the concerns associated with off-sales.
Yeah, thanks. In Edinburgh, we actually increased our over-provision area. It used to just be the old town, basically, and now we've increased it to include the new town as well. But most of the new applications we get are, and as you're talking about tourism, Edinburgh being the tourist city it is, most of the new applications are sort of restaurants. There's been a lot of hotels built and restaurants, and also the variations in licences where they're wanting extended hours for children, and again related to tourists. Obviously for having a meal accompanied with an adult, but there has been an increase in wanting longer hours for children in Edinburgh, and in some ways it's a good thing because it is changing the ambience, shall we say, of the premises. So that that's the challenges we've had, but that's under an over-provision policy. So it's not. It's changed. I think I would argue that Edinburgh having an over-provision policy has changed an awful lot of the premises into more food-oriented and less of the so-called vertical drinking establishments. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, listen, at this stage I'm going to take my leave, and I'm going to hand the chair over to Sarah for the rest of the meeting. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. The Convener has just gently pointed me to a couple of questions that we haven't yet asked in relation to health data. I was wondering if we could get some evidence from the witnesses on the health data in terms of the information that comes from health boards to licensing boards to aid their policy development and decision making, and just to get a quick snapshot from round the table as to what information you currently get from your health boards and whether the health boards provide the same data or whether their approach is different. Don't know if any of you got a perspective on that or if you've got a perspective at a national overview level.
Yeah, AFS has been trying for several years to actually support stakeholders to develop and gather evidence, particularly to support the policy statement. So we developed a sort of licensing toolkit, and that outlined all the different sort of sources of health evidence that you could access. And we also heavily promoted research by the University of Edinburgh and Glasgow, which looked at sort of health data at data zone level and linked that to outlet availability. And again, we supported local areas to use that data. I would say in terms of what we see boards reporting on, there is similarities. You know, it tends to be things like alcohol-related death rates, alcohol-related hospitalisation rates. What seems to work very well, actually, is where the local partners work together to collate evidence from multiple agencies. So in quite a few areas, there's maybe a profile that will go in from a forum or go in from the Alcohol and Drug Partnership, and that will combine health data. Again, it might include stuff around addictions, referrals, but that will then be combined with fire service data, police data, so things like alcohol-related crime. There might be child sort of care, social work statistics that go in there, people living with a drinker parent, and that all gets collated. So you can see different approaches, but I would say what seems to work best is where you get that collated data and where boards actually speak to the stakeholders beforehand to explore about what levels of data are available and actually agree what might be most useful for the board as the kind of national overview from looking at the policy statements.
Okay, and at the more local level, is there any different view on that issue? Is the data disaggregated sufficiently for you to operate with? Elena?
From the perspective of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, we do actually provide all 6 of our local authority areas what we deem as our over provision data. That does look at alcohol-related hospital stays, alcohol-related deaths, alcohol-related brain damage admissions and mental health discharges related to alcohol. But at Glasgow City and Renfrewshire level, I do try and collate as much as I can in order to provide a bigger picture. In fact, at Renfrewshire's board on Monday, I was actually asked for any gender-based violence data that could be provided, which is the first ask I've had from a board for that. So I'm away to look at that as well. And I think that's the recognition that alcohol does permeate into lots of different areas. I think there has to be a caution put against at what level that data can be available, because certainly in terms of addiction, child protection and gender-based violence, these may well have to only be reported at a local authority level in order to prevent identification of individuals, and that is certainly something that I'm very cautious about, especially in relation to child protection, because the numbers are small, but the impact that these small numbers have can be quite substantial, because essentially in relation to child protection, that could be a life of ongoing problems for that child, but it's still substantial. But we do try and ensure that the rest of our local authority areas from a board perspective are provided with the same information, and it's up to each of the individual health and social care partnerships within Greater Glasgow and Clyde as to how they then use that data. ScotFo also has profiles, so that information is taken from Information Services Department, and they put profiles up there as well, which licensing boards themselves can also access. They've got additional information, but that does include crime stats, as well as the deaths and hospital admissions.
Anyone else? Norrie?
I think I'm in danger of repeating myself, but you know, we do have in Edinburgh the NHS Lothian do report to the licensing board, and basically all the statistics which we've heard before, and it is available to board members, and we can also ask for a report, including the crime statistics, if we're concerned about a certain area. But the NHS Lothian basically only report on areas of over-provision. You know, they don't report every time. I think I mentioned that before. But the information is available. I think the intermediate data zones they use, and so it is made available if requested, or if it's an area that NHS Lothian want to put forward to the board.
Thank you. Right at the back, Harry.
Say Inverclyde, the intermediate data sets that was provided by the NHS were extremely helpful in preparing our policies, both in introducing an over-provision policy 5 or 6 years ago and then deciding to do away with it last year. However, I would say that the intermediate data sets for individual applications, we haven't really received anything like that before on any individual application.
Thanks. I've just got one final question about health data. As a result of the concerns around the availability of health data, it's now possible for licensing boards to designate their whole area as over-provided for. Do the participants around the table think that's been a helpful move in policy terms? I can see one nodding of heads and one not quite so sure. Do you both want to, I think Glasgow and Alcohol Focus Scotland, do you both want to comment?
I think the most important thing is that whatever approach to over-provision boards take, it is based on the evidence. So some boards will decide actually we'll have an over-provision area over the whole of area for on and off sales because the data we've gathered, what communities are telling us, you know, all the evidence points to that being the right approach. I think having a wider area does help in terms of maybe if people are travelling to buy alcohol, it makes it easier to determine your over-provision area. But I think it's also appropriate sometimes for boards to say, well, we know that there's particular problems here, so we want to take a targeted approach, because they might well have areas where there is no, issues to be concerned about, and there is no evidence that actually over-provision would be an appropriate approach. So I think the important thing is boards have that option rather than a whole area over-provision necessarily being better than a localised approach.
Did you want to come in on that point?
I would just say that in terms of using that health data, I don't think it was a change in the legislation that was absolutely necessary. I think if you were going down the whole area approach, I think you still would need to demonstrate by at least a small enough locality why each individual area within your entire area would have to be defined as an over-provision area. And just one final point on the use of health data. I don't think it should just be focused on the use of health statistics around public health being of assistance in determining individual licensing applications. I think in terms of granting or refusing, I think they should also be used in terms of how we regulate licensed premises, identifying if premises are in an area which is of a higher risk. Is there conditions that we can attach to those particular applications to mitigate the risk? But also maybe putting a responsibility on licence holders in areas where there's a higher risk from alcohol about what measures they should actually be putting in place through their own risk assessment and how they operate the premises. So maybe using health data in that wider sense rather than just this focus on whether it can be used to refuse an application.
I see some noddings of heads around the table, so thank you very much for that point. I just want to double check with Andy. You were interested in the community issues. Have you asked all the questions that you wanted to raise?
Yeah, I mean, I was just interested in the local licensing forum, so
you got that on the record. And Norman, final
just
point?
to add one wee thing, and maybe Andy will be interested in this. Again, when we were consulting an over-provision policy, and we decided what area would be over-provided, there was an area, Leith, and it was the Leith Partnership were using the statistics, that data, to ask Edinburgh to include Leith as over-provision, and we didn't, and they were very angry, but they used the data that was available. So, communities were involved, and they were using the data available from the intermediate data zones, etc. So we just so I better mention Leith because they're still annoyed with the licensing board.
Yes, I suppose that makes a point. Being involved in the process doesn't necessarily mean the community views are actually happy with the end result. Yeah. Annabelle, did you have something to say?
Briefly, just on the community engagement side of things, just really to pick up a point, I think it would be remiss if we didn't flag this up. So on the issue of licensing boards having greater involvement with community planning partnerships, get the right title. We did receive a submission from the Law Society of Scotland. I probably should say at this point I'm a member of the Law Society of Scotland, but not practising solicitor, that they would have concerns about how that would work, given that the licensing board is to be independent. And it'd be, I know we don't have very much time left, but I think that's quite an important issue. Maybe, Murray, do you have any?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that point. That I'm a member of the Law Society Subcommittee on Licensing, so a bit of a potential conflict there. But I would be concerned, I suppose, about any changes that create maybe a greater link with community planning partnerships, because I think already we've got the ability for, whether it's community councils, elected members, local individual residents to have an input to the licensing process. And I think it's about making better use of how we enable people to put in representations or objections, getting information across about how they engage with the licensing process. And we certainly try to do that more this time through the development of the policy statement, bigging out and holding community-based meetings, getting community councils in for focus group sessions. So I think it's more about maybe giving more understanding about the licensing process and, again, changes to legislation that we should focus on.
Okay, thank you for that. Is that all our questions from colleagues? Right. If it is, can I thank all the witnesses, not just for being interrogated this morning and being prepared to engage with us, but also for your submissions that you sent us in advance, and others who also submitted. That's been extremely helpful to us. As a committee, we will now consider in private how we want to take forward the evidence that you have all given us today. So can I thank you very much for coming today, and can I suspend the meeting briefly to enable the witnesses to leave? Thank you very much.